This is Joker and his first long-lining lesson. I've just been sacking him out with the lead row, with the lunging lines, having them around his hocks and so forth, so that he doesn't get frightened by that. It's really important that you do that, because quite often a horse will feel those lines at the back and he'll start running forward away from the lines, and that can get very ugly very fast. The reason I put the lines behind the horse, rather than just putting them through the higher rings on the surcingle, is that if I put them through the higher rings on the surcingle, it's very easy for the horse to turn and face me. Once the horse learns that he can turn and face me, it's very easy then for him to get himself into a nasty knot and twist the reins around himself. And if he's not very well handled, like this horse obviously isn't, then that might scare him hugely, and it could all end in a horrible wreck, and he could injure himself very easily. So I like to teach it this way, because it stops the horse from turning and facing me, and once they've learnt that habit, it's quite hard to break. So much better off starting off the way you mean to carry on. And when he's much better at this exercise, I will take it up through the higher rings. The reason for that really is that through these lower rings, because it goes around behind his rump, every time his back leg moves, he actually gets some pressure in his mouth, which I obviously don't want, because it's a meaningless pressure in the mouth. So it's not ideal, but I think it's better than nothing. And what I've decided, over the years of using this method, that this is the best way to teach it, although it's not ideal, and you move quickly onto having them higher. I really like long lining because it's so much better for the horse than lunging. The horse is in frame, in a nice soft frame, using his top line, and you've got one rein in each hand, so you can actually feel how the horse is feeling in his mouth, as opposed to, a lot of people say to me, oh yes, but I lunge in side reins, and my horse is in frame because he's in side reins, and you can't actually feel the horse in the side reins, so you don't know whether he's leaning on the reins or not. He might be quite heavy, and so then in that case he's just going round and round, learning to deal with a lot more pressure. So when you get on and ride, he's going to expect you to hold him up. The other thing with side reins I often find is horses go into a false outline where they jam their nose in against their chest, and they're using all the muscles underneath their neck instead of the ones on their top line, in a nice relaxed manner. And so I find those two things, people that lunge with side reins, those are the two things I have against that I don't like terribly much. And the other thing just about free lunging is that I find that it's great if you want to get your horse fit, but it's not terribly good at building the muscles you want necessarily for riding the horse, so it's not good at building top line at all. And when I got on these young horses, I want them to have some muscle to support me. So this is the sort of thing I do really from yearlings onwards. I try to long line them and build up their top line, so by the time they reach 3, they're actually ready to ride and they've got some muscle, and I'm much less likely to injure them. This is the first time that Joker's had the lines on. This is what I always do. Is the hardest part often is getting the lines on and getting behind the horse safely, and he did quite well with that. And now all I want to do is just change direction in walk for a little while. Very important that you stay behind the horse. I always tell people to look at the horse's tail when they're changing direction, and if you do look at the horse's tail, it stops you from getting in front of the horse. And if you get in front of the horse, it gives him the opportunity to turn and face you. And so just there I've picked up the whip. It's best to have the whip out there, because you don't really know how the horse is going to react to the whip. First off, most untouched horses, of course, don't react to the whip at all. It's usually those ones that have seen the wrong end of the whip that react. I've got a long lining DVD out which goes into great detail about how to change direction and focuses on my hands quite a lot, so if you're more interested in that, you could have a little look at that DVD. I want to keep the horse in walk, changing direction, and making sure, see, every time I change direction, the horse moves away from me. He changes direction away from me like an outside turn. Now, given that I've recently taught this horse inside turns in the round pen, he is probably going to want to turn and face me. So it's important that I establish these sort of turn away from me cues before I ask him up into trot. It's also really important that he's happy with the rope around his legs, and I try and just lift that rope and lower it so that it touches his hocks and below his hocks as well, just in case he takes fright and I lose him. The round pen, is such a fabulous place, and it's such a good place to train things, especially something like long lining. It's much more difficult to train this without a round pen, even in an arena where you've got corners and you'd need a lot more directional control to train this in an arena. Whereas here, Joker's already quite used to going around me.
Wow, Miss Kate.
While I see how the horse is going to get on with the trot work, I start off with just a few strides of trot and then bring him back to walk. I'm not going to argue with him. If he wants to trot for longer, I'll certainly let him trot for longer. But I try and do just really short bursts, so he's always going forward but thinking backwards a little bit. So it's easy to come back to me. Again, here, the really important thing here is emotional level. This isn't the easiest thing to do in the world, long lining, and until you actually get in the middle and try it, it quite often looks easy on the outside, but it's not all that straightforward. And so you've really got to be terribly aware of your horse's emotional level, because if you put him under too much pressure, it will end in quite a nasty wreck quite quickly, especially with these types of horses that have very little experience. Because if you drop a rein, very quickly the horse is then being chased by the rein, and so that can be quite scary. On the plus side, of course, if you do a good job, it sacks your horse out very nicely for part of the skills test, which is towing something. As you can see, he's got the reins, they're coming behind him, and it's a very little jump from here to actually putting something behind him and asking him to pull it. The long lining is an essential lesson that I will definitely be teaching to my horse in the way of the horse competition. I would like to get to long lining in the second hour, would be ideal. I'll long line him certainly before I ride, and I'll long line him walk, trot and canter, and so I can get the cues set up, the verbal cues on the ground for walk, trot and canter, so that I don't have to kick the horse. He just tried to come in and have a look at me. Since this is his first session, and this lesson is just 10 minutes long, that's fairly typical of the first session for long lining. And I would expect, to take 10 or 15 minutes in my first session in the way of the horse. And then I'll long line him again in the final hour. And that's when I'd introduce the canter. I probably wouldn't introduce the canter in this session, in this very first session. That might be just a bit too much for the horse. It is a wonderful training tool, but it does have its drawbacks as well. There's a few things about it. What I just mentioned about having the rope going behind him is one of those drawbacks. Another one is the distance away from the horse that I am. You can see, Joker's in a reasonably good sort of soft frame, but because I'm such a long way away, every time he gives to the bit, even when I release it, it takes quite a way for that release to reach Joker. And even when it does, it's not a full release because I've got that whole length of rein and there's wind resistance and all sorts of other things going on. So it is very hard to release well on the long lines. And that's, I think, just one of those things that one needs to bear in mind when you're long lining. I don't think it's a reason not to do it, but I do think that whilst it's very useful for teaching a horse about softness, once you have a horse that understands that, you're actually working backwards if you're long lining it. So it's not something that I continue to do with horses forever. I do it when they're young. I do it a lot before I ride them. But after that, the only time I'd long line is if they'd been off on a break for a period, of months or something, and they hadn't been in, then I would do that to build up muscle and, well, if a horse had been out in spring grass, perhaps to check if it had a buck or two in it.